Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our final State of the Program episode. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. I've got Joe Meade with me, and tonight it's the Indiana Hoosiers, the national champions, 16 and 0. Kurt Signetti, Fernando Mendoza, and Indiana have conquered the game. Joe, obviously, this is my team here, so we might get a little bit of a biased look from my end. But overall, before we get into the specifics, hard to have really like things that went right, things that went wrong, but overall thoughts on this year for Indiana.
I mean, aside from injuries, and that's more on a little player basis, really hard to assess this season anything. Should I still have you?
I can see you, but you're frozen. Um, so yeah,
Oh, Sean, sorry, I cut out for a bit.
yep.
Um, Hard to assess anything other than an A plus, unless you do by like a player per player basis, which of course on any team from 2019 LSU to '01 Miami, uh, you know, this is like this is kind of like a teacher's review with a student who's the teacher's pet, gets all A pluses, all gold stars on their desk. It's really tough to say anything bad. This is going to be unlike a lot of programs who, even like the more successful ones, like the Ohio States of the world, the Oregons, we still had stuff for them to work on. This is the complete opposite, Sean. This is more off, maybe what you could build off, or maybe we could look back on, which of course indicates you had quite the year and a historic year at that.
In terms of, I think obviously it's a little bit more special for me, but I think it was a special season that everybody will remember pretty positively, unless you're a Purdue fan. But being that Purdue's not really a football school, and neither is Indiana, to be fair. But yeah, this was a special year. I think a lot of people thought that last year the chips probably fell in a way that Indiana didn't have to be an amazing team and still got to the college football playoff. There was none of that this year. The schedule got tougher. They go on the road, or we'll go through all the games specifically, but um, there's a new sheriff in town when it comes to football. And in terms of the coaching staff, all of the main coaches are going to be here next year. And to hold off both the coordinators from going was pretty impressive, too. But to start this year, Joe, it was three rather uninteresting non conference games. The Old Dominion game was close for a little bit. Turns out the Old Dominion team was pretty good. They ended up doing pretty well in their conference. Kennesaw State and Indiana State, not really much to get through in those three games, other than it was pretty clear early on that from Fernando Mendoza was the real deal.
Yeah, not only that, Sean, but I think the other thing you saw too is just kind of the workmanlike attitude return from 2024. By no means was there, how do I put this? Were their opening three games impressive, especially their first one against Old Dominion. In hindsight, it's really that week four game, Sean, where people's eyebrows started to raise a lot.
And in terms of that week one game, Joe, just one more thing there. Kalon Black did fumble on the first drive of that game. That would be the last fumble that Indiana would lose the rest of the year. Now, they
Yeah.
had a couple fumbles that they fell on, but obviously not turning over the ball was a theme pretty early here with Indiana. And I think everybody expected them to go 3 and 0. And then when they hosted Illinois on Big Ten Saturday night, they were 19th in the country. Illinois was 9. And it was an ass kicking, 63-10. Obviously, every person will have a different moment in the year. And when we're through all the games, I'll ask you when this team was the real deal. But this was at least a little bit of a peak that Indiana is above that upper middle class that they didn't really get to play the year before.
Not only that, Sean, it was truly a top 10 matchup. Last in 2024, I should say, they didn't really beat anyone of note. Let's call it what it
Yeah.
is. They still had an impressive year, but their most impressive win might have been against a Michigan or a Washington or a Nebraska, all teams that struggled to get to 7, 8 wins. Like, that's not really indicative of a team that is a perennial powerhouse. This was the first time against the perennial head coach in Brett Bielema. We saw him just get gutted. And even aside from his time at Arkansas, Wisconsin and Illinois, you don't really see that happen to Illinois. Like, for example, Ohio State a few weeks later couldn't even do that to Illinois.
And then after that, Joe, I think at least some attention was placed on the Hoosiers. They go on the road to Kinnick, which is one of the most dangerous games in the country. And they find themselves in a ball game with Iowa. Really could have gone either way. The Hawkeyes had a field goal to take the lead with about 2.5 minutes left. It hooks wide. Wasn't a chip shot. It was in the mid 40s. But after getting a little bit of a break there, Indiana took control of their own hands, and Fernando Mendoza hit Surratt for what ended up being the game-winning touchdown. But as good as Week 4 was, Week 5, Indiana found a way across the line.
Yeah, and Sean, if you do get a chance, guys, click on our Iowa video. Iowa is probably the best like four-loss team we've ever seen in modern college football in the Big Ten. They were this close to beating Oregon and Indiana. Like, think about it this way: two of the four semifinalists were seconds away from losing to Iowa, albeit at Kinnick, but still, that's impressive nonetheless. Getting back to Indiana here, Sean, I think this just showed that this to me was not that they arrived, but that they're for real because I've seen really good teams lose in Iowa. Michigan in 2016, number three. I mean, the record is what it is there for top five teams. Ohio State's lost plenty of games there. Michigan, Penn State's lost twice there as a top team in '08 and 2021. And they needed a last second buzzer beater to beat them too in 2017. So this is a team that Iowa's a place where dreams go to die. And I don't think Indiana's dream would have died per se if it went there. I mean, if they lost there, but certainly it alters the course of their season, minimizes kind of the looser mindset they had while playing. So, um, you know, that's when stuff kind of gets really interesting. And then you have a 2 week buildup to the game in Eugene.
Well, those were the two I thought barometer games for the year going into the year. I thought that if they could win those two, they'd have a good chance to go to the college football playoff. They do. They win. They blow out Illinois, and then they win what was an ugly game at times against Iowa. They made the plays that needed to be made when they needed to be made. Then they have the bye. They're going out there to Autzen, like you said, Joe, for week 7. College game day goes out there. Everybody picks Oregon except for Pat McAfee. And this was a game that was pretty tight in the first half and into the second half. And then Indiana took control of this game, only gave up 3 points as a defense in the second half, and wins 30-20 over the Ducks, who many people thought was the best team in the Big Ten, or one of the best teams in the Big Ten, and ultimately still ended up being. But the Hoosiers team won a ugly slog defensive battle, and then they were able to get up and down with Oregon a little bit here in a game that not many people expected them to win.
Yeah, Sean. And the biggest part of this game is that pick six by Mendoza. That's normally let's call it that's a kill shot for a lot of teams.
Yeah.
To get the crowd into it, ties the game. I think the anecdote is I have no reason to not believe it. Kirk Snetti asks him if he's having fun. He reaffirms that he is, and they go back and they go right back down the field and finish at that time. Sean, this is probably the most shocking like, up to that point, to be honest with you, I think most of the nation was shocked. Indiana people would claim they weren't shocked. I'd argue that a decent number of them were. Um, but this put the entire nation on notice. And I think you still have the skeptics, but I think anyone who really follows the sport knows the type of program Dan Lanning's built there in his 4 years at Oregon, was fully aware that Indiana was a top five team. I don't think people thought national title contender at that point, but certainly a top five team shoo-in for the playoff up to that stage, especially when you looked at their remaining schedule the rest of the way.
And going into this game, Joe, I thought we both agreed that we could see Indiana winning this game, but it would probably be a coin toss game. Indiana threw a pick six in the second half and still won by double digits. That was one to me that I think if like that there was nothing fluky about that. Indiana played decent and still was better than Oregon. So I think at that point, Indiana 6-0, they get up near the top of I don't know exactly when they got to number 2, but it was either that week or after the Michigan State and UCLA games. Neither of those were particularly noteworthy. They go to College Park and take down Maryland pretty easily. So they're 9-0 on the road at Happy Valley. And this was the game that produced probably the moment of the regular season in college football. Indiana, to be fair, for 3 quarters was the better team. It built a lead, but another sort of important interception by Mendoza gives Penn State a chance, and then they score and then I think a couple or Indiana gives it away. Penn State punts back, and with less than a minute and a half to go and no timeouts, Indiana was down four and needed to go down and get into the end zone to win the game. And they did that with the catch of maybe ever in college football with Omar Cooper Jr. This one was another one of those games, Joe, where it all sort of fell apart really quickly. All of a sudden, Michigan was or not Michigan, Penn State was gashing them on the ground, and you got the crowd into it. And there are a lot of good football players over there, and man, Penn State might win this game, but Mendoza and Indiana delivered and got to 10-0.
Yeah, you say fell apart quickly. The only thing that fell apart quickly were Michigan and Penn State seasons, for completely different reasons. Just getting back on task here, though, Sean, this was probably the most important game. And I hate making this a separate video, and we won't. We might look back at this game and when Ethan Grunkemeyer is really good in 1 or 2 years, this could be I guess, the trailer for that. I thought he played a really outstanding
Yeah,
game. Brian Haynes on the Joel Klatt podcast recently said,
it was the most
certainly.
points that Indiana gave up all year.
And not only that, he said of all the quarterbacks we played, he was one of the most impressive. And consider who else they played that year: Julian Say and Dante Moore. Even a Carson Beck. I know people roll their eyes at that. Ty Simpson. For him to say that about the redshirt freshman was really significant. And I think at that point, Sean, that really started Penn State's resurgence into winning. I know, albeit they went 6-6, but winning three straight games with their offense just looking like a completely different unit. It looked like the worst unit in college football in September to one of the better ones in all of college football, in spite of record. Indiana sustained all that storm. Penn State, under Terry Smith, was looking for that signature win just to kind of salvage their season. They had everything working against them, and by a toenail, they got it.
And in terms of the next 2 weeks, Joe, it was relatively easy wins over Wisconsin and Purdue. Indiana was very banged up in these games. They were missing a ton of players, so they didn't run up the score like they usually do. I mean, they sat on the ball, they ate the clock, and they ultimately end up winning big in both of them. But they probably could have got to 50 in either of them if they wanted to. But they tried to heal up for what was a Big Ten championship game that we could see coming from a long way away. Probably for about a month. It was number one Ohio State against number two Indiana at Lucas Oil and Indy, and um, a lot of people didn't give Indiana a chance in this game either. And the Hoosiers, to me, in this game showed defensively that they were probably the best in the country because Ohio State had sort of, rumbled teams to death without really trying this year. And people thought they would do that to Indiana too. But Indiana was able to get to Julian Say and rough him up a little bit. And despite not being all that sharp offensively, they were able to win the Big Ten championship 13-10. So I think we went into this game too saying that we think Ohio State will probably win, but Indiana's good enough to be in a game with them, and they've been in close games. Ohio State hadn't yet, and then Indiana State wins the Big Ten, and all of a sudden they're number one in the country. But that didn't stop people from still doubting them. But they got the job done in Indy.
I think in terms of Big Ten country, I can speak for most of it. When they stopped Ohio State twice on fourth down, albeit everyone's going to call it the Jaden Fielding missed field goal, but there were multiple instances in that game shot. Indiana looked on the ropes and they delivered a shot that got Ohio State off them, and they were able to get it to the center of the ring. You know, even that weird blocking penalty where the guy took out the other guy.
Oh, the chop block on
Yeah,
the defense.
defensive
Yeah,
shot block. Normally that's a play Ohio State will run and go with that. And maybe it was more to the fault of Ohio State than the greatness of Indiana. You could argue that all day. But the bottom line is most of the country assumed Ohio State was more talented than Indiana, and composite wise, there's no argument there. I don't think
yeah.
you
I
as a
mean,
diehard would argue that. But
there's a really good chance, Joe, that four Buckeyes are taken in the top five of this upcoming NFL draft. And
yeah,
yeah,
and with that said, Sean, it didn't look like Indiana, aside from the two early interceptions from both sides, it looked like Indiana was the superior team each time. They made the plays when they had to. They didn't really, each time there was a 50-50, you felt like Indiana got the play. There were 7 or 8 plays. I felt like Indiana made 5 or 6 of them.
and coming into this game, Joe, Ohio State had just come in with getting the monkey off their back with Michigan. The Michigan defensive line, which many of us thought was really, really good, did absolutely nothing against Julian Sayin. And there was a little bit of a theory going into this one that the smaller, slower guys on Indiana aren't going to be able to do much either. Now, the defensive scheme proved a little bit too complex for the Ohio State offensive line. They were able to get to Julian Sayin. He looked a lot more of a college quarterback with pressure than he did sitting back there and picking teams apart with his, top top five receivers in college football. But
Two top three, let's call it what it
yeah,
is. Yeah.
yeah. So Indiana gets across the line here, and after it, I said, Joe, I think Indiana can be even better than this. Like they scored 13 points on 4 red zone drives. Like
Yeah.
they could have scored in the 20s here, but they still were able to get the job done in the clutch, like you said. 3rd and 6, throw it up to Charlie B, and he was able to bring it down more than once. So Indiana goes into the college football playoff as the number 1 overall team, still 3rd best in odds to win the national championship. Georgia and Ohio State 2 and 3 were on the other side of the bracket. Um, and then Indiana would play the winner of Oklahoma and Alabama. Alabama goes in there, they fall behind big, then they come back and beat the Sooners. And then it's Alabama against Indiana at the Rose Bowl. And they get once again on ESPN, every analyst except for Pat McAfee picks the Crimson Tide, and the Hoosiers make them look awful early. 38-3 Hoosiers. This was a different class at the Rose Bowl, and I don't even think that Mendoza had the best game. Like, he was solid. He's still under 200 yards passing. The defense obviously came to play. Ty Simpson got a little banged up, was ineffective, ended up getting benched, but Indiana came into this game and showed that they were way better than Alabama.
And what was hysterical too, Sean, there were a few instances at 10-0 when Alabama was down 10-0 rather. They could have got back in the game. Indiana would swarm them. Ty Simpson looked like, the run game was completely nullified. And I know
Yeah.
Alabama struggled with the run all year, but it was a complete non-factor. It got to the point where Kalen DeBoer in the middle of the second quarter, it must have been on like the teenage Madden mode where, I have no interest in run. I'm just going to throw the ball each time. And Indiana was having none of that. They repeatedly tried to draw him off sides. That's where the Signetti meme, one of many, comes from. So this showed. I think it shows. Alabama, I still think was a really good team this year. I know they had their ups and downs, but this kind of showed you, that SEC dominance, for lack of a better term. I know we're a Big Ten podcast, really not there anymore. I think practically has been non-existent since Nick Saban retired, and especially after the 2023 season. But I think that was on full display here, Sean.
And Alabama had beaten Georgia at Georgia during the season and had then played in the SEC championship and lost to them. So this was pretty close to the best that the SEC got, and it wasn't even close. After this game, Joe, I think we really started to know that if you were bad at something, Indiana was going to make you pay for it. And not
Absolutely.
only if you were bad, I think if you were not good at something, Indiana was going to attack that relentlessly until you either adjusted or you laid down and cowered. And that's what happened here. This was an easy victory for Indiana. And then they roll into the semifinals, Joe, against Oregon. It's a rematch, this time at the Peach Bowl in Atlanta. Again, 5 out of the 6 analysts on ESPN picked Oregon to win this game, but the Hoosiers made the game in Autzen look like a minor league game. 56-22 Hoosiers. Um,
And it
this
wasn't
was
even that close.
this was a total relentless um, dis dismantling of a really good football team in Oregon, but obviously the Hoosiers and D'Angelo Pons take it back for a pick six on the first play. Oregon did bounce back with a touchdown of their own, but it was pretty clear, maybe halfway through the first quarter, that Oregon was probably not going to be able to keep up unless they kind of stopped defensively. Ultimately, they didn't, and Indiana showed that they are better than the team that they were in the beginning of the season, too. Um, so, 2 playoff games, 2 easy wins for Indiana.
And that game, Sean, really, an NFL Super Bowl, y'all remember from our lifetime, is the Seahawks and the Broncos in Super Bowl 48 at MetLife Stadium. The first play of the game, Peyton Manning takes a safety. I think it had a lot to do with crowd noise, but kind of a similar thing. Dante Moore looked frazzled first play. makes a really poor decision, throws a pick six, and kind of from there, you see a little fight in tying it up. But from that point on, it was the dominant run game. The defense swarmed Dante Moore. I mean, a lot of people blamed him. I can't really because he
Yeah,
had 2 seconds to throw.
more than half of the times that Dante Moore was sacked this year was by an Indiana Hoosier.
Yeah.
And it was pretty clear that, look, they were able to get a couple drives going there in the second half when Indiana was playing prevent, but Oregon had obviously a little bit of a personnel issue at halfback. They had third stringer in there, and they had some defensive players taking snaps. But look, if you couldn't run the ball, you weren't going to do it against Indiana. So they were ultimately able to stop them there and cruise to another victory. Then a week and a half later, Joe, it's Miami and the Hurricanes in the national championship in their home stadium. It's going to sound like a broken record because it is. All but one of the ESPN analysts picked Miami to win this game. Um, but the Hoosiers win 27-21. It was a dominant first half from the Hoosiers, and then they did just enough in the second half to get across the line. This was a little bit of a different game. I thought Miami's trenches definitely came to play and may have actually been better than Indiana's lines, but Miami ultimately dug themselves just too much of a hole, and then they had to push it at the end, and Carson Beck ends up throwing the interception to the nephew of one of the players on Miami's national championship winning team in 2002. But Miami certainly came to fight here, and they could have won if a few things went different, but Indiana persevered in the moments. Again, you get the Fernando Mendoza 4th and 5, which ultimately gets the moment of him reaching for the end zone, but wasn't as easy as the other ones, but Indiana still got the job done.
And you see a team that picked itself up. They have that false start, that 2nd and 2, I believe, in the red zone when,
Yeah, game was
they
over
get
if they
two
get
more
that first
yards.
down.
There's no last drive. There's no Carson Beck. And you got to give credit to Miami here. They got
Yeah,
pretty damn close with no timeouts, I'd say, to winning this thing in front of their, I guess, home crowd, whatever you want to call it in air quotes. Um, they made Carson Beck pay for taking that risk. Should Carson Beck have taken that risk? It's probably easy to say no in hindsight. I thought he had to.
he would have had
Uh,
to eventually.
yeah.
Yeah,
So, he played roulette, and unfortunately, as you know in gambling, Sean, uh, the wins are high, and then the losses could be very, very low. And unfortunately for Miami, they felt that in the most apparent way possible. But Sean, I know, unless you want to talk more about this game, I kind of want to go big picture.
yeah. So I mean, the last thing here is this was different defensive profile for Indiana. They did sit back here and asked Carson Beck to tear him apart, and he really didn't. Stay in front of Malachi Tony. This was not sort of the exotic stunts and from the Indiana defensive line. They pretty much stayed in coverage more than usual. But Indiana completes the 16-0 season. Joe, we had coaches just, I believe it was it Sarkisian from Texas, who said he didn't think he'd ever see a team get to 16-0. But the Hoosiers do it. And big picture, I think, we look at their defense and, they have a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. There's going to be double digit NFL players on this team. This team is going to stack up there with one of the best to ever win the title.
Without a doubt, Sean. And the biggest part here too is you didn't see the traditional star profile. You look at the last three national champions, Ohio State, Michigan, and Georgia. Littered with 5 stars. Michigan wasn't littered with 5 stars, littered with 4 stars. A lot of these guys, their base high school profile, not too impressive. This was the first true, I'd say, modern transfer portal college football national champion.
Yeah.
Now, it's year really 3 or 4 of this like NIL portal era. I'd say I think some would consider it year 2, where people fully are operational in it. At least like some of the major programs or most of the major programs. So I, Indiana, let's say they never win another national title for the rest of our lifetime. This will forever be a blueprint. For a while, people wanted to replicate the Nick Saban blueprint. All right, you know, we're gonna get as many 5 stars as possible. We're gonna develop really, really well. Our two deep's gonna be at NFL level. Yep. And then, when Nick Saban retires, there was a little power vacuum in the sense that who do we model our program after? A lot of people thought it'd be the Kirby Smarts, Georgias of the world. Dabo Swinney at that time took a downfall necessarily from the national stage. Can Indiana be the new blueprint? I think at least for now they are, Sean. I don't think, you could copy tit for tat what Kurt Signetti has done. but they're certainly going to be a template or blueprint for a lot of teams looking to win their first national title in a while, or at least try to compete for that national title.
The main takeaway for me, Joe, is that of course like development still matters. You know, Indiana, if you just brought these guys out of high school to here, they're no way they're anywhere close to a good
No,
team. They some of them developed at other places, but they still improved as the season went along. I don't think Indiana had the best injury luck either this year. Like they did have a lot of they weren't the they didn't have the most depth. Signetti has gone on and said that, but they lost their Lee Beebe, who's supposed to be one of the top running backs in week 2. They lose a couple of defensive players. They lose the best defensive tackle in Stephen Daly after celebrating against Ohio State. They, were down the best left tackle in the country for a little bit there. They were down Surratt. They were down Cooper. Like, they, of course, if, they were lucky that Mendoza didn't go down, that would have been a different story. But they didn't have like some great run of injury luck here either. They lost some players. They ultimately were able to get them back, most of them back. Um, but in terms of this blueprint, I look you got to take some risks, and you've got to buy low on some players. And certainly Stephen Daly, a first team All MAC player from a winless Kent State team, any team could have got him if they wanted to at this level. Any team comes in for him, and that is not a 5-star who asked for a ridiculous amount of money that only a few teams could buy. He just for example, there's other ones in the portal. There's players like that he brought over from James Madison and Aiden Fisher and D'Angelo Pons who will be going to the NFL. Um, they've got some really solid linemen from other solid teams in the portal, and development still matters, Joe, whether it's on your team or somewhere else. And playing experience matters too.
not only that, Sean, too. The big thing with Indiana as well as culture does matter. A lot of teams, I'm not naming names, we could probably figure out who they are, do this transfer portal haul. Florida State, I'll name right now. It worked in 2023 magically. They should have been in the college football playoff. They've since tried to repeat that model. It's not worked. Texas Tech, sure, I think they're on their way there, but they're still short at a few positions. Indiana is the gold standard right now. Um, and Indiana isn't necessarily, they have a lot of money, the Mark Cubans of the world, the alumni base, if you didn't see on their resurgence tours, what I'll call it, is massive. But I don't think this is necessarily a pay to play team either.
I
That
don't
that's
think
the
they're in the
biggest
top
thing.
10, Joe. They might be top
I mean,
15,
they
but I
might
don't
be
think they're
now
top
top
10.
10, but
Maybe,
they
yeah,
probably
maybe
weren't even
after.
top 20 going into 2025. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah, so I think other coaches will try and emulate this, but in terms of the actual coaching, I think everybody improved as the season went along. Even as they started to get banged up, you had perceived weaknesses filled, and there is a little bit of there is continuity in the coaching staff. Like I said earlier, going into 2026 now, they have everybody back except for the quarterbacks coach Chandler Whitmer, who's going to the NFL. They're replacing him with the quarterbacks coach last year, who went to UCLA to be the OC, Tino Sunseri. So the coaches are going to be pretty similar. I think it is quite honestly unbelievable that they kept both the coordinators, Mike Shanahan, the offensive coordinator, who is certainly a really good offensive coordinator, but the really special one I think is Bryant Haynes on the defensive end. He is being paid over $3 million next year. He'll be
As
the
a head
highest.
coach salary too.
He'll
Yeah.
be the highest paid defensive coordinator in the country. I'm honestly quite surprised that he did not get a head. I think he can get any head coaching job in the country. His defense, he took a bunch of 3 stars and 2 stars that were undersized and slower than the opposition and turned them into one of the best defenses that I can ever remember. So in terms of offense, I think look, Mike Shanahan, it would stink if he were to go, but I think Signetti and the other coaches could find someone else to keep that level the same. But Brian Haynes on the defense, I think, might be one of the very few who could have done that.
Without a doubt, Sean. And maybe he's the next like young phenom. We've seen Dan Lanning, we've seen, kind of the Ryan Day, necessarily more offensive side. A lot of the top coaches right now, Sean, aside from Kurt Cignetti, came from being a very good coordinator or assistant coach. So Marcus Freeman's another one right there, right, Sean? So I bet you he is the top three coaching candidate, and probably without a doubt top one coordinator candidate for a head coaching job, but probably top three in all of college football.
And I think Indiana is certainly, doing all that they can to keep him around. I would promise him the head coaching waiting if I was Indiana. And I don't know, how Signetti's in his early to mid 60s. He might want to do this for 10 more years. I don't know. But if he doesn't, I would want Brian Haynes as the next head coach. All right, Joe, let's turn it to 2026 now. The Heisman Trophy winner is gone. There is a number of other players who are gone. Indiana didn't waste a lot of time. In fact, they did most of this before the season actually ended in the transfer portal. They replaced virtually everybody that's leaving. They picked up a number of players that will fill the open spots, most notably Josh Hoover at quarterback from TCU. Um, off the top of my head, Nick Marsh, the wide receiver from Michigan State, is the other notable name. There's a few other Boston College running back and, a few other defensive players. But Indiana didn't waste a lot of time in the portal. They got who probably a top five quarterback and maybe the number one wide receiver.
Yeah, Nick Marsh, I think, is a real game changer. I know Elijah Surratt, Charlie Becker, and why am I blanking on the last? Omar Cooper. I know those three are really good receivers. I think Nick Marsh is better than all those guys,
I
and
think
just didn't
Becker
have.
has round one potential, maybe round
I
two.
I think Marsh though has even more potential than that
Yeah.
shot. I just think he was in such a.
Well, yeah, I was saying Marsh. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think
Yeah.
he was in such a bad situation at Michigan State, and you gotta credit him because after his freshman year, he really did stick it out. After that putrid 5-7 year, followed up by a putrid 4-8 year, I think he gave that program his all, and I certainly don't think the attitude thing is a factor. I'm gonna trust Kurt Cignetti to assess his attitude the right way, and even if it's bad, I'm pretty sure he can reel it in. It's just a bold prediction of mine. Uh, Going forward here, Sean, though, this is where Big Ten teams, the last two have struggled. Michigan follows up their 23 national title campaign, albeit with all the stuff we know now, not too shocking. But Ohio State mainly follows up the 24 campaign with 12 straight wins. You're thinking, man, like
They're
one
going to
thing
do
we
this
forgot to
again.
talk about
Yeah.
in this video, they're going to do this with no problem. Uh, and then they had two big problems in Indiana and Miami, the two teams in the national title game. Can Indiana kind of buck that trend? I'm not saying win it all, but followed up with maybe another round of four appearance, maybe get back to the national title game. I think repeating is such a not unrealistic, but such a lofty and ridiculous expectation to put onto a team while we're doing this in March.
Yeah. A lot would
But
have to go right.
yeah, but you look at the schedule though, Sean. I do think without seeing any lick of spring ball or seeing one game or hearing any rumblings, getting back to the playoffs should be a realistic goal for the Hoosiers.
And they do open the season with North Texas, a team that was very close to the playoff this year. Now, of course, the staff and the quarterback have gone to Oklahoma State, but they're one of the best teams in the American. Howard in Western Kentucky, it's been sort of the game plan of this administration at Indiana to do this in the age of the 9-game Big Ten. And, you really don't have to schedule anybody in the non conference with 12-team playoff, at least for next year, and then maybe even more after that. But in terms of the Big Ten schedule, Joe, there are a few changes here. The secondary rivalries are being dropped, from what I can tell. No Old Oaken Bucket game. Or no, yes. No, Spittoon is Michigan
Brass
State.
platoon,
Yeah,
yes.
so no return game for Nick Marsh, but you haven't played. You're playing the two teams that Signetti has not seen yet in Minnesota and USC. You get to host Northwestern. You get to go on the road to Rutgers and Nebraska. But the two games that obviously come to mind are in back-to-back weeks here in the middle of October. You are hosting Ohio State, and what is a rematch of the Big Ten championship game, and then you're going to the Big House to face Kyle Whittingham and the Wolverines. It feels like Indiana is probably going to get to that Ohio State game undefeated, unless something goes wrong. And whether they're national championship contenders again or going to try and sneak in the playoff might come down to what happens in the middle of October.
Yeah, Sean. And what's funny is I think we'll know how Ohio State will be. They do return Matt Patricia. They bring Arthur Smith in as OC. That'll be probably a college game. I'd be shocked if one of those wasn't college game day. Certainly one will be big nude kickoff, but I would be. I'll make this bold prediction. I bet both college game day and big noon follow the Hoosiers around there, both to Bloomington and to Ann Arbor. I think both those games have blockbuster top five, top 10 matchup potential. And, aside from the Michigan Ohio State game, that's probably game number two on both those teams' schedules.
And then, USC at home late in the season. Who knows where the Trojans will be at that point? Could they be, um, going to Bloomington, needing to win that game to stay in the playoff hunt, maybe? And then Indiana has to go up to Washington, which is a spot that not a lot of teams have won at. And then you're going to end with the old Oak and Bucket game at home this year. But, Joe, looking at this, knowing what we know now, I think we're at the point where this would be a disappointment if Indiana doesn't go to the college football playoff.
Yeah, and again, barring an injury or something we're not aware of, or it is possible one of these teams, like a Michigan or USC, is even better than we think. Because I
Yeah.
think we all pencil in Ohio State as the top five team. But regardless, Sean, I think the biggest thing, if this program stays consistent, even a good 9-3, which a lot of fans are going to scream at me for saying, uh, I don't think necessarily ruins any momentum this program's had. I think the proof's in the pudding, for lack of a better term. And, aside from at Ohio State, there's really no program in the Big Ten that holds a candle to this. Oregon hasn't necessarily climbed the mountaintop. Michigan has, but had all the stuff, we'll call it, going on in the background. So, in terms of regime and momentum, Indiana across the country is the place to be right now. So we'll see if anyone in the conference or certainly the country can try and change that. But final grade shot A plus plus.
Yep. Best grade that you could possibly get. And I think it might actually spill over into next year. Joe, if Indiana don't have a great season, they go 9-3, they miss the playoff. What you can ask Indiana fans will be like, who cares? We won last year.
Exactly.
Maybe 5 years down the road, and maybe things are different. But I think the story of the first 2 years for Indiana is that when they don't play a good team, they take care of business. That might be all that it takes to get to the college football playoff in this day and age. Um, so can you keep that standard? Look, if you lose to Ohio State, if you lose at the Big House, doesn't mean you're not a really good team. But can you beat everybody else? That's the question. I'm really excited. I'm going out to the Rutgers game. I've already got tickets for me and my dad.
I
We're
really hope that's a game they win, Sean.
It's the first time I've never seen Indiana play football before, so that'll be fun. Um, I believe I'm at 22 Indiana basketball games, so a little catching up to do. But yeah, so obviously you do start the season with two, maybe even three bottom half teams. So if you can get to that Ohio State game undefeated, you're going to have a really good chance to make the playoff. And after all, Joe, like next year's team might be more talented than the year before. And we said it in 2025. We said we think this team's better than last year's team. Now the schedule's tougher and they might, it might not fall the exact way that we think, but they have more talent. They have a better quarterback. They have a better center. They have the same great defensive players back. They have a couple ads. They have a lot of really talented players coming in, and I think there's a real good chance that that last year is more the norm than an exception. But
Absolutely, Sean.
all right, Joe. This one's a little longer than the other ones. I think rightfully so. There was a lot to
Yeah,
talk about
totally.
here, but we are going to wrap it up here. This is the 2026 or 2025 state of the program for Indiana. This is the last video of this series. It's done pretty well. So tentatively, we're going to do this for basketball too, at least for some of the top teams. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.